An ordinary fisherman pulled a strange metal sphere from the sea dot, but when he opened it, chills ran down his spine. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning rose over the sea like a pale coin pressed against a vast, cloudless sky. A thin mist still clung to the coastline when Elias Moore, his weathered hands steady despite the years, pushed his small fishing boat from the shore. The old wooden hull groaned in protest, as it always did, and the air carried that familiar mixture of salt, fuel, and the faint metallic tang of rust. For most men, this world of waves and solitude might have felt endless and empty, but for Elias it was home. His refuge, his living, and the one thing that still made sense in a life that had long since quieted down. He was a man molded by the sea, skin darkened and rough from decades under the sun, shoulders broad from hauling nets, his face marked with those deep, permanent lines that came from squinting into wind and water. He spoke little and preferred silence over company. His home, a small wooden shack at the edge of the bay, contained nothing of comfort, just a bed, a table, a kerosene lamp, and a few framed photographs of people who no longer existed in his world. His wife had died years ago, and the only son they'd had moved north to a city Elias had never visited. Now there was only him, his boat, and the sea. As the motor sputtered to life, the soft rumble vibrated through the wood beneath his boots. The water was calm, the kind of calm that could deceive even an old sailor. The horizon stretched in every direction, clean and endless, broken only by the lazy dance of gulls that followed his boat, hoping for scraps. Elias didn't mind their presence. They were his only companions most days, their cries a reminder that life, however small, still filled the air around him. He steered toward his usual fishing ground, an area marked in his mind more than on any map. He knew the seabed's character here, the drop in depth, the cooler currents that carried fish near the surface. It was instinct born of years, not science. He trusted it more than he ever trusted the world on land. The sun climbed higher as he set his nets, the rope sliding through his calloused palms with mechanical precision. Everything about this process was familiar, almost meditative. The sound of the ocean, the creak of his gear, the distant hum of the engine, they formed a rhythm he'd lived by for most of his life. By midday, the sea had settled into a deceptive stillness. The air was heavy, and even the birds had gone quiet. Elias leaned against the side of the boat, wiping sweat from his forehead, his eyes half closed as he listened to the soft slap of waves against the hull. He had a feeling, one of those small, unexplainable instincts that sometimes came to him before a storm or an unexpected catch. It wasn't fear exactly, but an unease that made him straighten and glance at the water's surface, which seemed darker than before, heavier somehow, as though something far below was watching. When he began to haul in his nets, the first few meters came easily. Then the rope went taut, as if it had snagged on the ocean floor. Elias frowned and adjusted his grip, giving a few hard pulls, but the resistance only grew. The strain bent his back, and the wood of the winch groaned. Whatever was caught was heavier than anything he'd ever pulled from these waters. His first thought was an old anchor or a tangle of debris, perhaps a rock, maybe a piece of shipwreck. But as the net began to rise, a glimmer of dull metal broke the surface, wrapped in seaweed and barnacles, water streaming off its curved shape. He froze. What emerged looked disturbingly like the top of a mine, smooth, round, with a few small studs protruding from the surface. His breath caught. For a long moment, he simply stared, waiting for something, some hiss or spark to confirm his fear. None came. The object swayed gently in the net, water dripping back into the sea with slow, deliberate rhythm. It was a perfect sphere, roughly the size of a barrel, its once silver skin now mottled with rust and green growth. Every instinct screamed at him to cut the net loose and let it sink back to where it belonged. He had heard the stories, old wartime minds still drifting in forgotten corners of the ocean, deadly remnants from an age that had long passed but never truly disappeared. Fishermen who pulled up such things were rarely lucky twice. And yet, as Elias stood there gripping the wet rope, another thought came uninvited. What if it wasn't a mine at all? What if it was something else? Something valuable, something lost that might finally give his life a turn for the better. The war had ended generations ago, but the ocean still guarded its secrets. He had seen ships pass with metal detectors and divers, searching for treasure, for relics of history. Maybe this was one of those relics. Maybe he could sell it to a collector or a museum, or even to the authorities for a reward. His heartbeat quickened. Poverty was a heavy net of its own. And after all these years, Elias had learned that hope could be just as dangerous as fear. He squatted beside the net, studying the object. There were no spikes like the mines in old pictures, only smooth plates and faint seams that ran in perfect circles. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate, as if crafted for some precise purpose. The surface bore faint markings, letters, perhaps numbers, though they were buried beneath years of corrosion. He leaned closer, touching it with the back of his hand. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the chill seemed to sink straight through his skin. For a moment, he imagined the thing exploding, imagined himself and the boat vanishing into a column of fire and foam. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding, but nothing happened. The ocean remained calm. The boat rocked softly, and the metallic sphere swayed in the sunlight, harmless and heavy. He sat down, breathing deeply, trying to think clearly. Let it go, he told himself. Drop it back. No one would ever know. But curiosity is a cruel anchor. It pulled at him with invisible weight. He thought of returning home with an empty net again, of facing another week of meager meals and unpaid debts. And he thought of this strange object, its hidden purpose, its mystery lying just beneath its skin. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Elias had made his decision. He couldn't let it go. He tied the net securely, reinforced the ropes, and began the slow, delicate process of lifting the sphere onto his deck. The strain made his arms tremble. The crane protested with creaks and sharp metallic cracks. The boat leaned dangerously, dipping low into the water. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd lose everything: boat, gear, and life all at once. But the ropes held. Inch by inch, the sphere rose and settled into the corner of the deck with a heavy, final thud that sent ripples through the hull. The boat stabilized again, though it now rode unevenly, tilting toward its new burden. Elias crouched beside it, breathless, watching the sunlight glint faintly off the wet metal. The sphere looked peaceful now, inert, as if it had been waiting for someone to bring it back into the world. He felt both pride and unease. Whatever it was his now, his discovery, his risk. He sat beside it as the sky deepened from gold to violet, eating a small piece of dried fish, unable to take his eyes off the thing. The more he looked, the more he noticed. There were 3 small holes arranged in a triangular pattern, each lined with rusted bolts. Around one of them, a faint engraving, too faint to read in the fading light. He tried shining his flashlight into one of the holes, but it went only a few centimeters deep, ending in darkness. The air cooled quickly. The sea stretched calm and endless, but Elias no longer felt its peace. He tied the sphere securely to the deck and checked the sky. To the west, clouds were gathering, thick, gray, and bruised. A storm was forming, and he was too far from home to risk heading back. The nearest land was an island he had only seen on old maps, a place Fisherman once visited before the great hurricane drove them away decades ago. Haven Island, they called it. He didn't like the idea of going there. It was said to be deserted now, nothing but broken piers and empty cottages swallowed by vines. But he couldn't stay out here all night with this weight aboard and a storm approaching. He would have to risk it. He started the engine again, turned the bow toward the east where the island would be, and muttered a silent prayer to the sea he had loved all his life. The wind picked up, slapping the waves harder against the hull. Behind him, the metallic sphere sat unmoving, glistening faintly in the dying light. Elias didn't look back at it again, though he could feel it there, heavy and patient, as though it were listening to the ocean's growing roar. By the time night fell, the world was nothing but water and wind. His small boat creaked under the strain, and spray stung his face as he gripped the wheel, eyes narrowed against the dark. Lightning flickered far away, lighting the horizon for brief, ghostly moments. Through it all, he kept his course steady, guided by instinct more than compass. He knew he was close. He could almost smell the wet earth of land somewhere ahead. Hours passed before a faint outline appeared in the blackness, a jagged coastline, dark trees swaying beneath streaks of rain. Relief washed over him like a wave. The island was real, and he was still alive. He slowed the motor, easing the boat toward the broken skeleton of a pier. The storm had weakened into drizzle by the time he tied his ropes to what remained of a piling. Elias sat there for a long time, letting the engine die into silence. His clothes clung to his skin, heavy with salt and rain. Behind him, the mysterious sphere glistened under the lantern light, water trickling from its seams. It looked ancient, patient, like something that had waited decades for this very moment, to be found, lifted, and carried ashore by the one man foolish or brave enough to do it. He stared at it until exhaustion dulled his thoughts. The storm clouds drifted east, leaving the sky open and black, dotted with thin, cold stars. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a tremor of something he couldn't name. Fear, fascination, maybe even guilt. Whatever it was, he knew it had only begun. The sea around him sighed softly, and as the tide shifted, the boat bumped gently against the pier. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow." And with that, Elias turned off the lantern, stretched out on the deck, and closed his eyes. The night wrapped around him like a tide, and the ocean, calm once more, rocked the boat in a slow, uneasy lullaby. The metallic sphere sat silently at his side, gleaming faintly in the starlight, waiting for morning. When dawn crept over the horizon, Elias woke to the low groan of waves nudging the boat against the pier. His joints ached, his clothes were stiff with dried salt, and for a few seconds he couldn't remember where he was. The world was gray, fog rising from the surface of the water, and the air had that hollow stillness that always followed a storm. Then he saw the metallic sphere, still lashed to the deck, its rusted skin glinting faintly in the pale morning light, and memory flooded back with a chill. It was real. He hadn't dreamed it. The heavy shape, the terrifying discovery, the night of wind and rain, it had all happened. He sat up slowly, rubbing his neck. His mind was thick with exhaustion, Yet the sight of the sphere pulled him to his feet. It looked different now, less like a threat and more like a question. The seaweed that had covered it was drying and falling away in clumps, revealing strange seams that ran around its equator like a belt. In places, the corrosion had flaked off, and he could make out faint outlines of stamped numbers and letters beneath the rust. He crouched beside it and squinted. The characters were almost illegible, but one marking stood out: USN 1944. His breath caught. The letters were unmistakably military. U.S. Navy, 1944, the middle of the Second World War. The realization sent a pulse through him. He had spent his whole life among men who still talked about that war as though it were yesterday, whose fathers and uncles had vanished in convoys or submarines lost somewhere in these very waters. It wasn't impossible that this thing came from one of those wrecks. He felt a strange reverence then, mixed with a creeping unease. Whatever secrets this object held, they had been sealed beneath the ocean for more than 80 years. He fetched a bucket of seawater and a rag, carefully wiping away the grime from part of its surface. The letters grew clearer, the metal beneath them a dull silver gray. There were no detonators, no signs of an explosive fuse, just bolts, seams, and the faint groove of a hatch line. Maybe it wasn't a mine after all. Maybe it was some kind of storage device, something meant to survive the depths. A container, perhaps, used to protect maps, weapons, or film from salt water. Elias rose and gazed out over the island. Haven stretched before him in silence, a long crescent of sand giving way to low, overgrown hills. The remnants of wooden docks leaned sideways into the tide like broken ribs. Farther inland, he could see the skeletons of houses, wooden frames blackened by time, roofs collapsed, windows gaping. Nature had reclaimed what the storm had abandoned. Vines tangled through the ruins and seabirds wheeled above the empty rooftops. It was a place forgotten by people, left to rot and sink back into the earth. He thought of going ashore immediately, but caution held him. The object on his deck still frightened him in ways he couldn't admit aloud. Even without visible danger, it felt alive, as if it were aware of being found. He had lived long enough to know when a man's instincts were trying to tell him something, and his instincts whispered to keep his distance. Yet curiosity burned stronger. He needed to understand what he'd hauled from the deep. For an hour, he studied it from every angle, looking for any sign of movement, any hiss, any warmth that might betray danger. There was nothing. Only stillness and that cold, metallic silence. When he finally convinced himself it was safe enough at least, he began to plan. He couldn't stay here long. He had food for a few days, water for maybe a week. The storm had scattered most of his equipment, and his fuel was running low. He needed help, or at least a place where he could offload the sphere without losing it to the sea again. He remembered hearing once that Haven Island had a small harbor on the northern shore, built decades before the hurricane. If it still existed, it might have shelter, a shed, a workbench, perhaps even tools. Somewhere he could think and perhaps open the sphere to see what it contained. The thought made his heart race. What if inside there was treasure? Not gold or jewels, but something worth more. Wartime secrets, rare materials, even relics that collectors would pay dearly for. But another thought followed. What if opening it unleashed something dangerous? Not a bomb, but a truth better left buried. He'd lived through enough disappointments to know that not all discoveries bring fortune. Some bring only trouble. He hesitated there, leaning against the rail, the mist curling around his shoulders. The ocean behind him was endless and gray, indifferent to his struggle. It would take back what it wanted when it wanted. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke twist into the damp air. He told himself he'd just take it to the harbor. That was all. Once there, he'd decide whether to open it or not. The decision steadied him. He turned toward the bow and started the engine. The old motor coughed and rattled before catching, sending vibrations through the planks beneath his feet. Slowly, carefully, he untied the ropes and eased the boat away from the broken pier. As he steered along the island's coastline, the landscape revealed itself in fragments between veils of mist. The shore was lined with the bones of old fishing shacks and piers, half-submerged nets still clinging to posts like ghosts of work long finished. He passed a collapsed boathouse, its roof resting in the shallows, and a rusted buoy that clanged softly with each small wave. Everything about the island spoke of abandonment, of time paused mid-breath. The sea here was shallow and deceptive. Twice his boat scraped against something beneath the surface, reefs perhaps, or the remains of a sunken dock. Each time his heart leapt, fearing a puncture that would end everything. He slowed the engine, letting the boat glide as he studied the dark shapes below. The water was so clear that he could see the remnants of concrete pillars, twisted metal beams, and, once, the glint of glass. A window, still intact, reflecting sunlight from a structure that must have fallen decades ago. He thought again about the war. This region had seen its share of battles. Convoys hunted by submarines, merchant ships blown apart, aircraft lost on patrol. Some said Haven Island had once been used by the military as a refueling point or a listening post. Perhaps the sphere had drifted from one of those wrecks, rolled by currents for years before settling on the seabed where he'd found it. The idea thrilled him and unsettled him at once. It meant he might have lifted a piece of history itself. The hours stretched long. The sun climbed higher, turning the mist into a shimmering haze. Sweat clung to his back as he guided the boat north. He kept glancing at the sphere, half expecting it to move, to open, to speak. But it remained silent, heavy as guilt. The faint line around its middle caught the light like a scar, and for a fleeting moment he imagined it splitting apart, revealing something he wasn't ready to see. He shook the thought away. By mid-afternoon, the northern edge of the island came into view. There, sheltered between two rocky outcroppings, was what remained of the harbor. The old dock extended crookedly into the bay, half its planks missing, but beyond it stood a row of weathered buildings, sheds, warehouses, perhaps even a small repair shop. The roofs were caved in, but the walls still stood, defiant against the years. It was the first sign of civilization he'd seen since the storm. Elias felt a flicker of relief. He steered the boat toward the dock, moving slowly to avoid the submerged debris. When the hull finally touched the pier with a soft thud, he shut off the engine and listened. The air was full of small sounds, the lapping of waves, the creak of wood, the cry of gulls. No human voices, no footsteps. He was alone. He threw a line around one of the remaining posts and secured it tightly. Then he sat down and looked again at the sphere. It seemed almost to belong here, among the ruins and rust. He imagined the people who had once lived on this island, the fishermen, the women mending nets, the children running barefoot across the docks. All gone now. And here he was, carrying a relic from their time, something dredged from the same sea that had taken their homes. He climbed onto the dock and stretched his legs, his boots sinking into the damp wood. The air smelled of seaweed and old oil. He walked a short distance along the pier, testing each step before trusting his weight to it. The island was silent except for the sound of the surf and the occasional whisper of wind through the reeds. It was beautiful in a way, lonely, decayed, yet still holding on. Elias turned back toward the boat. From this angle, the metallic sphere gleamed faintly in the sunlight, water still dripping from its seams. It looked less threatening now, almost serene, like something ancient and wise. He thought again of the markings, USN, 1944, and of the possibility that it contained something lost, something the world had forgotten. The idea filled him with both pride and fear. He wasn't a rich man, nor an educated one, but he understood what discovery meant. This could be his legacy, his one chance to be remembered as more than an old fisherman who lived and died by the tides. Yet even as he imagined it, a voice in the back of his mind whispered of danger, of consequences he couldn't foresee. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the harbor's edge. Most of the buildings were hollow, their doors ripped away, their floors slick with sand and moss. In one shed, he found a rusted workbench littered with old tools, a hammer, a wrench, a cracked lantern. Dust and cobwebs coated everything. Still, he smiled faintly. It was enough. He could use this place. He would bring the sphere inside tomorrow, away from the boat, and examine it properly. As the light began to fade, Elias returned to his vessel. The tide had risen, lapping higher against the dock. He checked the ropes, ensuring the boat was secure, and sat down beside the sphere once more. The air had cooled, carrying that faint metallic scent that always followed a storm. He ran his hand along the object's surface, feeling the texture of corrosion under his fingers. Somewhere beneath all that rust, under the history and the fear, was truth. He leaned back, gazing at the horizon where the sea met the darkening sky. The clouds were breaking apart now, revealing streaks of orange and violet. The day's fatigue settled over him, heavy but calm. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he would find out what he had really brought up from the deep. For now, he would rest. He tied the lantern near the sphere, its weak glow casting trembling reflections across the metal, and lay down on the deck once again. The boat rocked gently in the cradle of the harbor. The island loomed behind him, silent and patient, while the sea whispered below. Elias closed his eyes, and the sounds of the ocean filled the silence of his mind. Somewhere, far off, thunder rumbled faintly, a reminder that the world beyond this lonely island still moved, still breathed. He thought of home, of the small house by the bay, of the photographs on the wall, of a life that seemed distant now. He wondered what his late wife would think if she could see him here, guarding this strange relic of the past. Sleep took him slowly, like a tide rising around his thoughts. And when he finally drifted off, the last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the faint glimmer of the metal sphere, shining softly in the lantern's light, as though it, too, were waiting for dawn. When Elias awoke the next morning, the light was different. It wasn't the soft silver of dawn or the deep blue of open sea. It was pale and heavy, filtered through the drifting mist that clung to the shoreline like an old veil. The world seemed muffled. Muted waves, distant gulls, even the creak of the boat dulled as if the island itself demanded silence. He sat up slowly, feeling his body protest with the stiffness of hard sleep and age. For a moment, he didn't move, simply looking at the dim outline of the land before him. Haven Island waited quietly, patient and unwelcoming, its broken docks reaching into the gray water like the fingers of a drowned man. The air carried a damp chill, laced with the scent of seaweed and old wood. Elias rubbed his hands together, his knuckles cracked and pale, and looked back at the sphere still lashed to the deck. It hadn't moved during the night, though the way the light hit its surface now made it seem different, less like an object and more like a presence. Water had dried in uneven trails along its metal skin, and flakes of rust had collected around the base where it rested. He thought he saw faint engravings beneath the corrosion, symbols, maybe letters, but when he leaned closer, they vanished in shadow. He told himself it was only his tired eyes. He rose, stretched, and made coffee with the small gas stove he always carried. The thin aroma filled the air, mixing with salt. He drank it slowly, watching the mist roll and shift, trying to gather the will to step onto the island. He hadn't felt true unease in years. The sea taught a man to live with fear as a kind of background hum, but this was different. The island gave off a sense of abandonment that went beyond emptiness. It was as though time had stopped here, and he was trespassing in a world that had quietly chosen to die. Still, he needed shelter. The boat couldn't hold the weight of the sphere forever, and if another storm came, it might drag both of them into the depths again. He had seen an old boathouse the day before, half collapsed but standing enough to keep the rain off. That would have to do. He untied the mooring rope and stepped onto the pier. The wood groaned under his boots, slick with moss. Each step made the entire dock tremble, and a few planks gave way beneath his weight, but he managed to reach solid ground. The first few meters of shoreline were littered with the remnants of what must once have been a small fishing village. Rusted nets, shattered oars, and warped barrels were half buried in sand and grass. Small crabs scuttled among them, darting away when his shadow passed. The remains of houses stood in uneven rows, walls leaning toward each other as though whispering secrets through gaps where windows once were. Roofs sagged, beams blackened by years of salt and wind. A tangle of vines and thorn bushes crept up through what had once been streets, their roots tearing through wooden boards and stone steps alike. Elias paused before one of the cottages. Its door had long since fallen, and inside he could see what looked like a table and a single chair, both rotted and soft. A lantern, shattered but still recognizable, hung from a beam by a rusted hook. There was something heartbreakingly human in the sight. Whoever had lived here must have left in a hurry, probably when the hurricane came all those years ago. He imagined families packing what little they could carry, the sound of wind tearing through the palm trees, waves crashing higher each minute, the air filled with sand and debris. And afterward, nothing. The sea had swallowed their footprints and left behind silence. He continued inland until the trees grew thicker. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, and underfoot the ground gave way to patches of soft earth. Somewhere above him, a crow cried out, a sharp, lonely sound that echoed through the trees. He found the old boathouse just beyond the curve of the cove, exactly where he'd seen it from the water. The roof was half missing, the walls leaning inward, but the structure still stood. Inside, he found tools coated with rust, an overturned bench, and the faint scent of oil and mold. It wasn't safe, but it was better than the open air. Elias cleared a space near the doorway, pushing aside broken planks and an old tarp stiff with age. He returned to his boat to fetch his gear and the sphere. The task was grueling. The object was far heavier than he'd realized, and the sand offered no help. He set up a makeshift ramp using boards from the dock and slowly rolled the sphere down onto the beach, straining against its weight. The sound it made as it moved, a low metallic scrape, echoed eerily across the bay. He paused once or twice to catch his breath, half expecting it to shift or roll on its own, but it stayed obediently still. By the time he managed to bring it to the door of the boathouse, sweat soaked through his shirt and his arms trembled. He stood there, breathing hard, looking at the thing that had pulled him into this strange place. In the full daylight, its surface revealed more detail. 3 small circular indentations arranged in a perfect triangle, their interiors smooth but patterned faintly with tiny grooves. Around them, bolts rusted in place, their heads flattened with time. There were no markings of danger, no insignia of explosives, but the precision of its design spoke of something deliberate, mechanical, and secret. He ran his hand along the surface again, this time without fear. The metal was still cold, colder than it should have been. He thought of how long it must have rested at the bottom of the sea, decades of current and silence pressing down on it, and wondered what stories it could tell if it could speak. Perhaps it was nothing but a container lost from a ship. Perhaps it held evidence of something forgotten. But another possibility stirred in him, one that he barely dared think. If this was indeed part of an American military operation, and if it had survived intact, then its contents might be worth more than anything he could dream of. Enough to repair his house, to buy a new boat, maybe even to change his life. That thought was dangerous, but he couldn't shake it. He spent the next few hours exploring the rest of the village, searching for supplies. He found an old cistern filled with rainwater, still fresh enough to use, and a small shed where fishing hooks, lines, and rusted cans lay scattered. Most of what remained had been devoured by time, but he gathered what he could. The island had a strange kind of peace to it, but it was not a comforting one. It felt too still, as if the air itself had stopped breathing. When he spoke aloud, testing the echo, his own voice startled him. By midday, he returned to the boathouse. The sphere stood exactly where he'd left it, half in shadow. The sunlight filtering through the broken roof made its surface shimmer faintly. He sat on a crate opposite it, eating a piece of dried fish and staring at the thin seam that circled it like an equator. If there was a way to open it, that line was the key, but he would need proper tools and more light to work safely. He could start tomorrow, he decided. For now, he'd rest. He lay back on the floor of the boathouse, the boards creaking under his weight. The air was hot and thick with the scent of dust. Through a gap in the roof, he could see a sliver of blue sky. He thought about home again, about the bay where he'd spent his entire life. There, the days were predictable, filled with the rhythm of nets and tides. Here, everything felt uncertain, like a dream that might dissolve if he blinked too long. He wondered if anyone would come looking for him. Probably not. He'd told no one about his trip, and the sea had a way of forgetting those who went too far. As the afternoon passed, the wind picked up, carrying the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. The island was small, but its geography was wild. Ridges of stone rising abruptly from the earth, covered in vines and palms, their edges sharp as blades. From somewhere inland came the faint rustle of movement. Maybe an animal. Maybe just the trees. Elias had always been comfortable with solitude, but the kind that surrounded him now was different. It had weight. It pressed against his chest like deep water. He rose and lit his lantern before night came. The light flickered weakly across the walls, revealing dust motes swirling in the air. He sat near the sphere, listening to the crackle of the small flame. The metal reflected the light unevenly, casting distorted glints that shifted whenever he moved. It seemed almost alive in that flickering glow, like something that breathed slowly and deliberately. He told himself not to think such things. It was just an object. Just metal and bolts and rust. But when the wind howled through the broken roof and the shadows stretched across the floor, he found himself staring at it again, unable to look away. He remembered something his grandfather once said while mending nets on the pier years ago. "The sea gives and the sea takes, boy. It doesn't care which." At the time, Elias had thought it was about fishing, about losing catch or gear. Now he understood differently. The sea didn't just give and take fish. It gave and took stories. It gave you mysteries, burdens, things you might not be ready for. And if you weren't careful, it would take you with them. He turned down the lantern's flame and lay back once more. Outside, the tide was coming in, the rhythmic pull and crash of waves like a slow heartbeat echoing through the island's silence. Somewhere beyond the cove, a piece of driftwood thudded against the shore. The air grew colder, and he pulled his coat tighter around him. His eyes closed, but sleep didn't come easily. The sound of the wind scraping through the gaps in the walls mingled with the faint creak of the sphere as it settled against the floor. It wasn't loud, barely perceptible, but each groan of metal set his nerves on edge. He told himself it was only the wood shifting under its weight, but the thought didn't comfort him. When he finally drifted into uneasy sleep, his dreams were filled with images of the deep. Black water, slow-moving shapes, and the glint of something metallic turning just out of reach. He saw the sphere sinking, falling endlessly, its reflection twisting in the dark. Then he saw himself following it down, deeper and deeper, until the pressure crushed the air from his chest. He woke with a gasp just before dawn, sweat beading on his forehead, the lantern's flame long gone cold. The first light of morning crept through the cracks in the roof, painting thin bars of gold across the boathouse floor. The sphere gleamed faintly in that new light, quiet and unmoving. Elias sat up, rubbing his face, and felt a strange calm settle over him. Today, he thought, he would find out what secrets this island, and the thing he'd brought to it, were hiding. The next morning broke with a fragile stillness that carried both promise and dread. The tide had pulled back overnight, leaving behind a fringe of seaweed and shells along the sand outside the boathouse. Elias stood in the doorway, the wind brushing lightly against his face, and stared at the horizon where the pale sun rose out of the ocean like a slow-moving ember. The world looked almost peaceful, but inside him something churned, a tight coil of anticipation that wouldn't let go. Today he would find out what was inside the sphere. The decision felt final, irreversible, like stepping through a door that would not open again once it closed. He returned to the place where he'd left it the night before. The object sat motionless in the corner of the boathouse, half in shadow, its dull metal skin mottled with rust. Overnight, condensation had formed tiny beads along its surface, glistening now in the morning light that slanted through gaps in the roof. Elias crouched beside it, studying every detail. 3 circular holes arranged in a triangle, each with faint, precise grooves cut into their edges. A seam running perfectly around the circumference, separating the top and bottom halves, and that same marking, half hidden but undeniable, USN 1944. He traced the letters with his fingertip, the cool metal making his skin tingle. He felt as though the thing were watching him, waiting. The notion was absurd, but he couldn't shake it. There was a presence about it, a kind of patient gravity, as though the air around it carried its own weight. Elias had spent his whole life around machines, winches, engines, anchors, things built by men to serve a purpose. But this was different. This wasn't just machinery. It was intent solidified into form. Someone had made this to last forever, and it had succeeded. He gathered the tools he'd found yesterday: an old hammer, a chisel, a rusted crowbar, and a lantern for better light. They were crude instruments for something so delicate, but it was all he had. He placed them neatly beside the sphere and sat for a long moment in silence, as though seeking permission. Then he began. The first strike of the chisel rang through the boathouse like a gunshot, startling the gulls outside into flight. Elias froze, heart pounding, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. No explosion, no hiss of gas, no smoke, just the sound of his own ragged breathing. He exhaled slowly and tried again, gentler this time, easing the edge of the chisel along the line of the seam. The metal was stubborn, refusing to yield. He struck again, and gradually the corrosion began to flake away, revealing cleaner steel beneath. Sweat gathered on his forehead, dripping into his eyes. Time blurred into a rhythm of effort. Strike, scrape, wipe. The sound of metal on metal became the pulse of the morning. Outside, the tide shifted and the wind picked up, whistling through the broken planks. Dust and rust filled the air, catching the light like fine smoke. Hours passed before the first tangible sign of progress appeared, a faint shift, almost imperceptible, along the seam. It wasn't an opening, but it was something. Encouraged, Elias continued. He hammered at the bolts surrounding the circular holes one by one, until each finally loosened with a groan. Inside the holes, he saw faint indentations, not random scratches, but deliberate markings, like teeth on a lock. It was clear now. This thing was meant to be opened, but only in a specific way. He imagined the tools that once existed for such precision, keys or rods long since lost to time. Without them, he'd have to force it. By noon, his arms felt like lead. He paused to eat and drink, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the sphere. The light through the roof had shifted to a harsher angle, and he could see motes of dust swirling in its beam. Every sound, the rustle of the palm trees outside, the creak of the boathouse, felt amplified, part of a quiet ceremony. He chewed slowly, thinking about what he was doing. He was no archaeologist, no historian, no man of learning, just a fisherman. And yet, here he was, prying open a relic of history, something that might have lain undisturbed since the world was at war. The thought filled him with a mixture of pride and fear. He stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. "All right, then," he muttered, as though the sphere could hear him. "Let's see what you've got left to hide." He took the crowbar and wedged it carefully into the seam, pressing with slow, steady force. The sound that followed was deep and resonant, a low metallic groan that vibrated through the floorboards. He felt it in his bones. The two halves of the sphere shifted ever so slightly, the seam widening just enough to catch the light. His pulse quickened. He adjusted his grip and pressed harder. The gap widened again, then stopped. Something inside was holding it closed. He tried again, putting his full weight into it. The crowbar slipped, clanging against the floor. He cursed under his breath, retrieved it, and examined the seam more closely. There, deep in the groove, he noticed something. A thin line of dark material, hardened but brittle, like resin or wax, some kind of sealant. That explained the resistance. He fetched the chisel again and carefully began chipping away at it. Each flake released a faint, acrid scent that reminded him of oil and salt. When the last of the sealant gave way, the two halves separated with a sharp metallic snap that echoed through the building. Elias stumbled backward as a hiss of trapped air escaped from within, carrying with it the smell of metal and age, like the inside of an engine room long forgotten. For a long moment, he didn't move. The opening was small, just enough to reveal darkness inside. He waited, listening. Nothing stirred. Finally, with a deep breath, he lifted the top half. It moved slowly, protesting as though reluctant to reveal its secrets. Beneath it lay a cavity lined with steel, dry and perfectly preserved despite the decades underwater. Inside, arranged with almost obsessive precision, were several objects. A cylindrical canister sealed in wax, a stack of metal cases, a small compass, and what looked like a waterproof journal. Everything was packed tightly, wrapped in faded canvas that still bore the faint outline of military stamps. Elias stared, hardly believing what he saw. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't treasure. It was something far more extraordinary in its simplicity, a message from the past, carefully protected, waiting to be found. He reached in and lifted one of the cases. The metal was light, almost too light, and when he shook it gently, something inside rattled softly. He hesitated, then pried it open. Inside were glass plates, film negatives, perfectly preserved, each marked with coordinates and short notations in neat handwriting. He held one up to the light, squinting at the faint image of what looked like a coastline viewed from above. Aerial reconnaissance, he realized. The photos must have been taken from a plane. Naval reconnaissance missions, perhaps, documenting enemy movements. The canister likely contained more of the same, or data logs or coded transmissions. He replaced the film and picked up the compass. It was small, with a cracked glass face, but the needle still moved. On the back, engraved letters read, Recon Unit 12, Pacific Division. A chill ran through him. He knew then what this was. It wasn't just a lost container. It was a part of a mission that had vanished from the record. The men who'd carried this equipment had been scouts, their job to observe and record, and, by the look of it, they never made it home. Elias sat back on his heels, staring at the open sphere. The reality of it began to sink in. He had uncovered evidence of lives interrupted, stories buried beneath decades of salt and silence. For a moment, the thrill of discovery gave way to something else. Sorrow, perhaps, or reverence. These weren't his secrets to profit from. They belonged to history, to men who died doing their duty. But another part of him, the part that had spent years scraping for survival, whispered that this was his chance. These artifacts, if genuine, were worth more than he'd ever earn in a lifetime of fishing. He stood and paced the small space of the boathouse, his thoughts clashing like waves. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. Every time he looked back at the sphere, it seemed to watch him with mute expectation, as though judging what he would do next. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever choice he made here would mark him forever. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the beach, he finally forced himself to close the sphere again. He covered it with a tarp and sat outside the boathouse, staring at the sea. The wind had shifted. It carried the faint, dry scent of rain from the horizon. The island was quiet except for the whisper of waves and the cry of a single gull circling above. He thought of the men whose hands had packed those items so carefully, perhaps in haste, perhaps in hope that someone, someday, would find them. He imagined their ship sinking, the crew lost to the depths, the sphere falling through dark water until it came to rest on the seabed where he had found it. The thought filled him with a kind of humble awe. When night came, he lit his lantern and returned inside. The sphere sat silently under its covering, a relic of another world. Elias sat beside it, his back against the wall, and stared at the glow of the lamp reflecting faintly off the tarp. The question of what to do next gnawed at him, reported. Try to sell it? Keep it secret? There were no easy answers, only the sound of the wind outside and the slow, steady beat of the ocean. Before sleep claimed him, he reached out and rested a hand on the tarp. The metal beneath felt cold as ever, but somehow alive, humming faintly with the weight of all it contained. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind them he saw flashes of silver planes cutting through the clouds, cameras clicking, men shouting over the roar of engines. Then, silence. The deep, endless silence of the sea. Elias drifted into uneasy dreams as the lantern burned low, the island around him whispering its secrets to the night, and the sphere, his impossible discovery, waited patiently for what would come next. The following morning arrived shrouded in a quiet gray light that felt uneasy, like the calm that settles before an argument. Elias woke stiff and disoriented on the floor of the boathouse, his back aching from the hard planks. The lantern had burned itself out sometime in the night, leaving a faint trace of soot on the air. For a long moment he lay there, listening to the rhythm of waves against the shore. It was steady, but there was something else, an irregular sound beneath it, faint but distinct, the hum of an engine. He sat up, heart thudding. The sound came from beyond the cove, low and mechanical, growing closer. He scrambled to the doorway, pushing aside the flap of old canvas that served as a curtain, and stepped out into the damp morning air. The sea stretched before him, dull silver beneath a sky of iron, and there, cutting across the surface, was a small patrol vessel, naval gray, angular, its wake slicing clean through the water as it headed directly toward the island. Elias froze, instinctively ducking behind the corner of the boathouse. For a few seconds he could do nothing but stare, thoughts colliding in his mind. He knew immediately who they were, or at least what kind of men. The Coast Guard, maybe military, maybe something in between. Word must have spread faster than he'd imagined, or maybe someone had been tracking the object all along. He glanced back toward the sphere, hidden beneath its tarp, and a pulse of dread went through him. The vessel approached the dock with calm precision, as though its crew had done this 1,000 times before. He could make out figures now, 4 men on deck, moving with the practiced coordination of people used to command and obedience. One of them stood at the bow with binoculars, scanning the shoreline. Another signaled to the others, and the hum of the engine dropped to a steady idle. The boat eased alongside the ruined pier, ropes thrown and caught, boots clattering against wood. Elias stepped out from behind the wall before they could come looking. There was no sense in hiding. His own boat sat anchored nearby, unmistakable evidence of his presence. The men turned toward him immediately. Their uniforms weren't quite military but close, dark blue with no visible insignia, only patches that had been stripped or faded beyond recognition. One of them, tall and square-shouldered with close-cropped hair, called out across the water. "Mornin'," the man said, his voice carrying easily. "You're the fisherman, right?" Elias nodded slowly. "Aye. Been here a few days. Storm pushed me in." The man smiled without warmth. "That's so. Strange place to take shelter." The others climbed onto the dock and began spreading out, their boots thudding against the damp boards. They moved like men used to control, each glance sharp, every motion deliberate. One carried a clipboard, another a small metal case. The tall one seemed to be in charge. "Name's Officer Grant," he said as he approached, extending a gloved hand. Elias hesitated before shaking it. The man's grip was firm, his eyes the color of cold steel. "We got word there was some kind of recovery here. A fisherman bringing in wreckage, maybe ordnance. You seen anything like that?" Elias felt his stomach twist, so they already knew, or suspected. He forced a neutral expression. "Just debris. Nets caught something heavy a few days back. Thought it might be an old buoy or some machinery." Grant studied him for a moment too long, then nodded. "You bring it ashore?" Elias hesitated just enough to betray him. The officer's gaze sharpened. "We'll need to take a look," Grant said quietly, not waiting for permission. He gestured to his men, and they started toward the boathouse without another word. Elias followed, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The sand crunched beneath their boots. He wanted to speak, to explain, to demand an explanation himself, but the words died in his throat. By the time they reached the doorway, one of the men had already lifted the tarp. The metallic sheen beneath caught the light. "Here we are," the man said, and there was something like satisfaction in his tone. He stepped back as Grant entered, crouching beside the object. For several seconds no one spoke. Then the officer exhaled slowly and stood. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked. "About 50 miles west," Elias said. His voice sounded small, even to himself. "Caught it in my net. I thought it was a mine at first, but there's no fuse, no trigger." Grant circled the sphere, his expression unreadable. He brushed his fingers along the seam, inspecting the bolts, then straightened again. "You open it?" Elias hesitated. "I did. It wasn't easy." Grant's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have done that." "It was sealed," Elias said, defensive now. "I had to make sure it wasn't dangerous." "Dangerous," Grant repeated softly, almost to himself. Then he looked at Elias. "You have no idea what this is, do you?" Elias shook his head. "All I know is it's old. American, from the war. There's papers, maps, film." "That's enough." Grant's voice cut through the air like a knife. The other men froze mid-motion. "We'll take it from here." Elias blinked, stunned. "Take it? You mean?" "Standard protocol," Grant said flatly. "Recovered military property remains under federal jurisdiction. You understand?" "No," Elias said, anger creeping into his voice. "I found it. It was at the bottom of the ocean for 80 years and no one cared. Now you show up and—" Grant's expression hardened. "This isn't about ownership. It's about containment." He turned to his men. "Secure the object. Make sure the seal's stable." The others moved quickly, producing straps and lifting gear from their case. Elias took a step forward, fists clenched, but one of the men, a broad, quiet figure with mirrored sunglasses, blocked his path with a simple motion. The message was clear. "Stay back." He stood there, helpless, as they wrapped the sphere in heavy canvas and fixed it with clamps. A sound of metal against metal echoed inside the boathouse, mingling with the slow thud of Elias's pulse. It felt like theft, like watching a part of himself being taken away. Grant spoke again without looking at him. "For your own safety, you'll stay here until we're done. Once we've verified the condition of the material, we'll debrief you." Elias forced a bitter laugh. "Debrief? I see." Grant turned, meeting his gaze with cool precision. "You should. This isn't a game. That container holds classified data from a restricted operation. If it had been breached differently, it could have compromised more than you realize." Elias didn't respond. His mind swirled with frustration, disbelief, and something colder, fear. The officer's words were measured, professional, but there was an undercurrent of threat beneath them. He had no doubt that whatever this mission was, It wasn't the first time these men had cleaned up a mess that wasn't theirs to begin with. By late afternoon, the sphere was loaded onto their vessel. The men worked quickly, speaking in short bursts of technical language Elias didn't understand. When it was done, Grant returned to him. "You're to keep quiet about what you found," he said. "No stories, no photographs, no souvenirs. This stays between us. You'll be contacted if we need more information." Elias stared at him. "That's it? You take it, and I'm supposed to forget?" "Think of it as doing your part," Grant replied. "You recovered something important. History will handle the rest." "What about credit, compensation?" Grant smiled thinly. "You'll get what's appropriate." They left soon after, the patrol boat pulling away from the dock with steady ease. The hum of its engines faded into the distance until only the sound of waves remained. Elias stood on the pier long after they disappeared, staring at the empty horizon. The wind had picked up again, carrying the salty tang of sea spray across his face. He felt hollow, drained. Back in the boathouse, the space looked larger without the sphere. Only faint marks on the floor remained where it had rested, a ring of dust and scratches as though it had burned its presence into the wood. Elias sat on an overturned crate, staring at the empty spot. He tried to tell himself it was over, that maybe this was for the best, that something like that was too big for him, too dangerous to keep. But the logic didn't help. All he could think of was the feeling he'd had when he first opened it, that mix of awe and responsibility, of touching history itself. Now it was gone, taken, erased. Evening came slowly. The light faded to gold, then to gray, then to the deep blue of approaching night. Elias made a small fire outside the boathouse, feeding it driftwood and bits of broken plank. The flames flickered, their warmth doing little to ease the chill in his chest. He ate the last of his bread and sat there until the stars appeared, listening to the whisper of the tide. He thought about leaving the island in the morning. There was nothing left to keep him here now, and his fuel reserves were running low. But part of him couldn't quite let go. He felt as if something unfinished still hung in the air, some piece of the puzzle left behind. He looked toward his boat, where the ropes lay coiled neatly on the deck, and noticed something glinting faintly in the lantern light, a small, cylindrical object wedged between the boards near the bow. Curiosity prickled through the exhaustion. He stood, crossed the sand, and knelt to retrieve it. The thing was metal, no larger than his hand, smooth and unmarked except for a faint serial number etched into its side. When he turned it over, he saw that one end had been sealed with wax, the same dark, brittle material he'd chipped from the sphere's seam. Somehow, in the chaos of loading and lifting, this piece had been left behind. For a moment, he simply stared at it, the firelight dancing across its surface. Then he slipped it into his pocket without thinking. It felt like a fragment of truth, small and solid. Whatever was inside, it was his now, the one thing they hadn't taken. He sat by the fire again, the distant echo of engines long gone, and let the realization settle. He was alone once more, as he'd always been. But the world no longer felt the same. He had touched something vast and secret, something that didn't fit in the quiet life of a fisherman, and even as the night deepened around him, Elias knew that the sea had not finished with him yet. The night passed without dreams. Elias didn't remember closing his eyes, only the steady hiss of the tide as it crawled up the beach and withdrew again. When dawn came, the fire had burned down to cold ash, and a thin fog rolled across the island, swallowing everything in soft gray. He woke to silence, the kind of silence that felt almost staged, as if the world were waiting for him to make the first sound. His joints ached as he stood, brushing sand from his coat, and for a long time he simply stared at the empty place on the dock where the patrol boat had been. There was no trace of them, not even footprints in the wet sand. Only the faint outline of his own vessel resting quietly in the shallows and the emptiness left behind. He felt smaller now, as though some invisible cord that had tethered him to purpose had been severed. The sphere was gone, taken under the authority of men whose faces he could barely remember. Everything about yesterday already seemed distant, reduced to fragments of memory: the metallic weight, the sharp smell of salt and oil, the cold precision of Officer Grant's voice. For all he knew, it could have been a fevered dream, born of solitude and exhaustion. But when he reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushed against the small cylindrical object he'd found on the boat, and its cool, solid weight reminded him it had been real. He turned the cylinder in his hands, studying it in the pale light. The wax seal at one end was cracked but still intact, and the faint serial number along its side caught the reflection of the sea. Whatever was inside had survived decades underwater and the chaos of retrieval. He thought about breaking it open then and there, but something stopped him. The gesture would have felt like betrayal. Of whom, he couldn't say. Perhaps the men who'd made it. Perhaps himself. Instead, he sat down on the edge of the dock and watched the horizon. The sun was climbing now, burning through the mist. Far out, the sea glittered faintly where light met water. Somewhere beyond that line, the patrol boat would be cutting through the waves, carrying the sphere and its secrets back to whatever vault or base awaited it. He imagined Grant standing on deck, the wind tugging at his uniform, his expression unreadable. The thought stirred a bitter taste in his mouth. By noon, Elias had decided to leave. There was nothing left for him here but ghosts. The island had taken what it wanted, a story, a fragment of history, and given nothing back. He loaded his remaining supplies onto his boat, checked the fuel, and pushed off from the dock. The hull groaned softly as it met the waves, and for a moment he hesitated, glancing back at the ruins of the village. The boathouse stood half in shadow, its roof sagging, the doorway yawning open like a wound. He thought of the sphere sitting there just 2 days ago, gleaming in the sunlight. Now it was gone, and the island had returned to its silence. He steered the boat slowly around the northern tip of the island, the motor rumbling beneath him. The sea was calm, deceptively so, and the rhythmic slap of water against the hull carried a strange melancholy. He passed the spot where he'd first anchored on his arrival and felt a flicker of nostalgia, absurd as it was. That moment, hauling the heavy net from the depths, seeing the metallic glint for the first time, felt like a lifetime ago. He wondered if he'd have done anything differently had he known what would follow, but the truth was he would have done exactly the same. Curiosity had always been both his gift and his curse. By late afternoon, the outline of the mainland began to rise from the haze. Familiar landmarks appeared: the lighthouse, the jagged rocks marking the entrance to the bay, the small cluster of weathered houses that made up his village. As he approached, the smell of the harbor reached him: diesel, salt, and fish. For the first time in days, he felt something like relief. Home, even when worn and weary, had its own kind of comfort. The docks were quiet when he arrived. A few fishermen were mending nets in the distance, their movements slow and methodical. They looked up briefly as he pulled in but said nothing, perhaps recognizing him, perhaps not. Elias tied his boat to its usual post and climbed onto the pier. His legs felt unsteady after days on the water. The world seemed smaller here, gentler, but also more indifferent. He was just another man returning from the sea, nothing more. At home, the house smelled of stale air and dust. He left the door open to let the breeze in and sat at the table, staring at the photographs on the wall, his wife smiling faintly, his son as a boy holding a fishing rod almost as tall as himself. The images felt foreign now, relics from another life. He poured himself a cup of water and drank slowly. The routine actions grounded him, but only barely. He felt disconnected from everything, as though part of him had remained out there on the island, still crouched beside that gleaming sphere in the half-light. That evening, as he prepared a simple meal, a familiar voice crackled from the old radio on the shelf. The news bulletin was brief, buried between reports of weather and politics, but the words froze him in place. Official sources confirm that a naval recovery team has successfully located and retrieved a lost reconnaissance container from World War II off the western coast. The discovery sheds new light on the final missions of the Pacific Division, whose operations were believed to have ended in 1945. Authorities have stated that the recovered materials will be preserved for study at the National Maritime Archives. No civilians were involved in the operation. Elias stood motionless, the knife still in his hand. The words repeated once before the report moved on to another topic. No civilians were involved. He felt the heat rise behind his eyes, a pulse of disbelief and anger. They had erased him entirely, as if he'd never been there, never found the object, never risked his life. All those hours of fear and exhaustion, the danger, the wonder, gone, stripped from the record in a single sentence. He sank into the chair and buried his face in his hands. For a long time he didn't move. The anger burned quietly, not in violent bursts but in slow, consuming waves. They had taken everything: the discovery, the recognition, even the story. He thought of Grant's face, calm and efficient, promising that history would handle the rest. Now he understood what that meant. History wasn't a truth, it was whatever men like Grant decided to write down. When the anger finally ebbed, what remained was a dull ache of betrayal. He looked up and saw the small cylinder lying on the table where he'd set it earlier, the last remnant of what had been his. He reached for it slowly, turning it over in his palm. The wax seal had cracked further, probably from the heat of the day. He thought again about opening it, this time without hesitation. The officials had their sphere and their glory, but this piece was his. He fetched a small knife from the drawer and sat back down. The edge of the blade slipped easily beneath the wax, prying it loose with a soft crack. A faint, musty smell rose as the seal broke. Inside was a tightly rolled strip of photographic film, still dark and slightly curled from age. Elias held it up to the light, squinting. The frames were tiny and hard to discern, but as he tilted it, an image came into focus, a group of men in uniform, standing on the deck of a ship, smiling at the camera. Their faces were clear despite the decades, young, proud, full of life. On the back of one frame, in faded ink, were words barely visible: Recon Unit 12, Pacific, 1944. He set the film down carefully, afraid to damage it. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the air thick with emotion he couldn't name. Those men had been real, their laughter caught forever in that thin strip of celluloid. He could almost hear the crash of waves behind them, the hum of the engines, the murmur of conversation before the storm that must have claimed them. They weren't just names in a report, they were people. He knew then that he couldn't let this be buried. Maybe he couldn't fight the authorities or rewrite their version of events, but he could preserve what mattered: the human part, the truth beneath the bureaucracy. He fetched an old wooden box from the cupboard, the one that had once held his wife's keepsakes, and placed the film inside. It felt right, almost sacred. That night, sleep refused to come. The rain started again, tapping softly against the windows. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in his mind: the island, the sphere, the way the metal had gleamed when he first lifted it from the sea. He thought of the men in the photograph, their faces full of a confidence that time could never reclaim. And he thought of how easily people like Grant could erase such lives with a sentence. The following day, Elias took the film to a small photography shop in the nearby town. The owner, an elderly man with hands as steady as stone, agreed to develop it. "Old film like this," he said. "No promises, but I'll see what I can do." Elias left the shop with a strange sense of anticipation twisting in his chest. 2 days later, when he returned, the shopkeeper handed him a small envelope. "You were lucky," the man said with a smile. "They came out clear as day." Elias waited until he was home before opening it. Inside were several glossy prints, each one a window into the past. He spread them out on the table. Sailors posing on deck, one of them holding a coffee mug, another adjusting his cap, a third gazing toward the horizon. They looked alive, unaware of what fate had in store. In one photo, the same metal sphere stood in the background, gleaming in the sunlight like a silent witness. He felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. These men would never know that someone, decades later, had found their message, their last trace. But perhaps that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were remembered, not as data, not as a classified mission, but as human beings. Elias framed one of the photographs and hung it on the wall above his table. Every morning after that, he would glance at it before leaving for the sea. It reminded him of what the ocean could give and what it could take away. The anger toward the officials faded over time, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He understood now that the world wasn't fair. The truth often sank deeper than any diver could reach. But he also knew that sometimes fragments of that truth surfaced, carried by tides to those willing to see them. Months later, when the local newspaper ran a feature about the historic naval recovery, Elias read it with calm detachment. There was a photograph of uniformed men standing beside the restored sphere, now displayed in a museum. The caption called it a remarkable rediscovery made possible by modern exploration efforts. He smiled faintly, folded the paper, and set it aside. On his wall, the photograph of the young sailors caught the afternoon light, their faces bright and unchanging. Elias finished his coffee, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside. The air was cool and fresh, the sea glittering under the sun. He walked down to the dock where his old boat waited, the same vessel that had carried him through storms and secrets. As he untied the ropes, he glanced once more toward the horizon. The world beyond still held its mysteries, but he no longer sought to own them. He had seen enough to understand that discovery and loss were often the same thing, two sides of the same wave. He started the engine, the familiar vibration rising through his hands. The boat drifted out onto the open water, leaving behind the village, the house, and the photograph on the wall. The past could stay where it belonged, but its echo would travel with him always, carried in the sound of the tide and the quiet rhythm of the sea that never forgot. The morning came soft and gold, a haze of light spreading slowly across the bay. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. Elias woke before dawn as he always did, though now his body moved more slowly, his thoughts less hurried. The months since the discovery had settled over him like sediment in calm water, layer after layer of quiet acceptance. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm, the creak of his small house in the wind, the steady hum of the motor, the sigh of waves beneath the hull. Yet something inside him had changed. The sea was no longer merely a livelihood. It had become a companion, a witness, perhaps even a keeper of his secrets. He sat on the edge of his bed, watching the first light creep across the floorboards. The framed photograph above his table caught the glow, and for a moment the sailors' faces seemed to flicker with life, their smiles frozen in a perpetual mourning. He rose and crossed to it, his fingers brushing the frame. "Still there," he murmured softly, as if to them. "Still remembered." Outside, the tide was high. The boat waited at its mooring, rocking gently. He walked down to the dock, his boots crunching over the sand. The air was cool, clean, the sky clear but streaked with faint clouds on the horizon. As he untied the ropes, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. The anger that had burned so fiercely after the government took the sphere had faded into something quieter, a recognition that truth had its own way of surfacing. The men in that photograph had been found through him, even if no one else knew it. That was enough. He pushed off from the dock, the boat drifting into deeper water. The engine coughed, then caught, the familiar vibration pulsing beneath his feet. He steered toward open sea, leaving behind the village, the harbor, the rows of weathered shacks clinging to the shore. The sun climbed higher, and the light spread across the water like a path. He followed it without thinking, guided by instinct more than intention. The sea was calm that morning, almost unnaturally so. The surface shimmered with a silvery stillness that made it hard to tell where the sky ended and the ocean began. Elias felt as though he were suspended between two worlds, the living and the lost. Every time he glanced down into the depths, he imagined the countless things lying below, shipwrecks, relics, bones, stories swallowed by time. Somewhere down there, far below, the place where he had first hauled up that strange sphere waited in silence. He slowed the engine and let the boat drift. The only sound was the gentle slap of waves against the hull. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It was the film canister, the second one he'd discovered weeks after returning home, hidden beneath a loose plank near his engine. He hadn't opened it. Something in him had resisted the urge. It wasn't fear this time, but respect. He believed some parts of the past were meant to remain sealed, not out of secrecy, but to preserve their dignity. He turned the canister over in his hands, feeling the faint engraving on its surface. It bore no number, only a single word scratched faintly into the metal: home. The letters were small, almost invisible, but they made his chest tighten. Whoever had sealed it had done so with care, as though understanding that one day it might surface again, to remind whoever found it that even the lost still longed for return. He placed the canister carefully back into his pocket and leaned over the side of the boat. The water below was impossibly clear. He could see the wavering shadows of fish drifting like fragments of smoke. The reflection of his face shimmered between them, older now, deeply lined but peaceful. For the first time, he didn't feel haunted by what had happened. The men who'd died, the officials who'd taken the glory, the silence that followed, it all belonged to the same great cycle of giving and taking that the sea embodied. He had been part of it, a witness, and that was enough. He dropped anchor and let the boat sway gently. The horizon stretched unbroken in every direction, an endless expanse of light. He could almost hear voices in the distance, not real ones, but echoes carried on the wind. The laughter of the sailors from the photographs, the low hum of engines from another era. It wasn't frightening. It felt like company. The sea, he realized, didn't just hold the dead. It held memories, fragments of the world that refused to disappear. For a long time, Elias sat there, watching the water shift and glimmer. His thoughts drifted to his younger days, his wife's laughter, the scent of her hair after rain, his son's small hands gripping his own as they cast lines together. Those two were part of the ocean's memory now, absorbed into the rhythm of tides and wind. He had spent his life searching for something lasting, something to prove he had existed. And, in a way, he had found it. Not in wealth or fame, but in the quiet act of remembrance. He reached into the small box beside his seat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the letter he had written weeks ago but never mailed. It was addressed simply to the Maritime Archive. In it, he described his discovery, not to claim ownership, but to ensure the story of the men in the photograph would one day be attached to their names. He didn't expect a response, and perhaps none would come, but he liked the idea that somewhere, in an office or a museum, someone might read his words and understand that history had been carried on the back of a fisherman's boat, not just in the hands of officials. He folded the letter again, slid it into a waterproof pouch, and tucked it under the bench. He would mail it when he returned to shore. For now, he just wanted to sit in the quiet. The sea was beginning to change color, the bright morning blue deepening to a darker shade as clouds gathered in the east. He knew the pattern. The wind would rise soon, and by late afternoon a storm might sweep through. But he wasn't afraid. He'd weathered worse. As the first gust brushed across the water, he looked once more toward the horizon. For a moment, the reflection of the clouds made it seem as though the sky itself were sinking into the ocean. The thought stirred something inside him, a sense of belonging, of being part of the same vast cycle that joined the living to the lost. He imagined the sphere resting quietly on a museum pedestal, stripped of its story, admired for its mystery. But out here, where it had once slept beneath the waves, it belonged to the world again, to the sea that had shaped and reclaimed it. Rain began to fall in soft, steady drops, tapping against the surface like fingers on glass. Elias stood and raised his face to the sky. The salt and rain mixed on his lips, and he smiled faintly. It wasn't joy exactly, but a kind of release. He understood now that nothing truly vanished. It only changed form. The sea took and returned, kept and revealed, and he was part of that eternal exchange. He reached into his pocket once more, feeling the small canister against his palm. Without hesitation, he leaned over the edge of the boat and let it fall. It hit the water with a faint splash and sank quickly, leaving only a ripple that widened, faded, and was gone. The act felt like closing a chapter he hadn't realized was still open. As the storm gathered strength, he turned the boat toward home. The waves rose gently, then, with greater insistence, the bow lifting and dipping with each swell. He tightened his grip on the wheel and smiled into the wind. Behind him, the sea reclaimed what it had lent, and ahead the faint outline of the coastline waited, softened by mist. When he reached the harbor hours later, the rain had turned to drizzle. The village was quiet, lights glowing faintly through the fog. He moored his boat, climbed onto the dock, and stood there for a long moment, watching the ripples fade around the hall. The world smelled of wet wood and salt and smoke from the chimneys. He breathed it in deeply. Back in his house, he hung his jacket, lit the lamp, and poured himself a cup of tea. The photograph still hung above the table, the sailors' faces shining softly in the lamplight. He raised his cup toward them. "You made it home," he said quietly, "in your way." He drank slowly, the warmth spreading through him. Outside, the storm moved inland, its distant thunder fading into the mountains. The sea, once more, grew calm. Later that night, before sleep claimed him, Elias stepped out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, and the moon broke through the clouds, laying a silver path across the water. He stood there a long time, listening to the slow rhythm of waves. The sound was the same as it had always been, ancient and steady, but it meant something different now. It wasn't just the voice of nature. It was the pulse of everything he had lived, lost, and learned to let go. He whispered a thank you to the horizon, not expecting an answer, but feeling one all the same. Somewhere out there, beneath the calm surface, the sea was holding the fragments of countless lives, some forgotten, some remembered. His own story had joined them now, not as tragedy or triumph, but as part of the great, unending silence that bound the world together. Elias turned back toward his small house, the light still glowing softly through the window. The photograph on the wall awaited him, the smiles of the men frozen forever in their moment of sunlit grace. As he closed the door behind him, the sea outside shimmered under the moon, vast and endless, whispering the only truth it had ever known, that nothing is ever truly lost, only carried deeper, waiting to be found again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true discoveries, and share this video so others can experience it too. Watch our next stories. Each one reveals something even more unexpected.